My family arrived in Seattle's Wallingford district in 1958, and I was only 2 years old. And one of my most fond memories, when I was about 4, I started to walk every week with my mother to the food giant on 45th Street. And we would go up the coffee aisle and stop in front of a big red machine, and they would grind the beans for you in the store back then. And she would take a little brown tin tie bag and put it under the chute and push a button, and there'd be a vroom sound, and the fragrance of the grinding coffee would billow over the aisle, and it would envelop me, and in my imagination it promised an exotic adulthood filled with impossibly rich experiences, not the least of which would be to finally try coffee. And yeah, you know what's coming, because when I was 19 years old, I was in the US Air Force and I finally tried coffee. And in the lab at 11 at night, whatever came out of this aluminum cylinder with a little black handle did not quite match my imagined flavor. And for the next 10 years, I studied classical flute and I worked at Boeing's Class A Standards Lab as a metrologist. This is a precision measurement specialist. And by age 31, I really had a desire to do something beautiful for a living. And when Geneva Sullivan and I started a cart on Broadway in 1988, and she is my trusted partner and saves me from any real work, but we started this cart and I became intrigued with Cafe Espresso. I said, here is a beautiful culinary art, perhaps in its infancy, that relies on a rigorous scientific technique, and it's an art that people will buy because it has drugs in it. I said, this is right down my alley. And now, 58 years later, I have to realize that I've dedicated my entire professional career to try to seduce the fragrance of coffee into a cup to enjoy as a flavor, and this is that story. Why is it that ground coffee smells so good and usually tastes bitter or astringent in the cup? A complete answer is very complex, but of course, the most important factor is the coffee itself. When you roast the seeds of the Coffea arabica tree, it is also called caramelization, because in the roaster it develops caramelized sugar, heat, carbon dioxide, and hundreds of very fragile aromatic compounds. These delicate fragrances are so fragile that they defy scientific classification because the act of measuring them destroys them. When I taste a coffee, I think in terms of two general categories. That's the caramelized sugar, of course, but of varietal tones. Like wine, coffee will pick up a recognizable flavor group, if you will, from the region it's grown in. So an Ethiopian Harar will feature a dark chocolate umami with a blueberry aftertaste in the best of it, and a very heavy body. A Brazil is recognizable as a Brazil because it has a light body and a hoppy, spicy taste. Either way, these delicate aromatics trapped within the coffee bean can survive up to 10 days if you store in a cool, dark place in the original bag you got it in. So the first answer to why coffee usually tastes rancid in the cup is the customer has received stale beans, or worse, pre-ground coffee. When you grind coffee in a favorable environment, cool and moist like Seattle, it's on peak for maybe 20 seconds. And what about brewing it? What about brewing it? It was the French or the Italians over 125 years ago that had the intuition that if we pressurize brewing water and shorten the percolation cycle, maybe we can get more of the fragrance into a cup. This is correct. Longer saturation methods, such as French press or drip cone, however lovingly applied, can only offer a crude approximation of that fragrance and maybe some notes on the roasting in the final cup. So it is true that it's technically possible to preserve the fragrance using the espresso method, but to do so is extraordinarily complex. The way the late Dr. Ernesto Ely explained this to me in Trieste, I visited him in 1989, my first visit, and he said, David, the espresso is an equation with 1,000 variables and only one perfect solution. When I returned from that trip, I developed my approach. I was going to isolate and perfect each factor that affected this espresso coffee. I do come from an engineering family, and remember, my specialty was precision measurement. And as I worked, it occurred to me that these machines, they're being sold all over the world. And outside of Italy, there was absolutely no standard practice. So I published my factors approach in 1995 in a book called Espresso Coffee, Professional Techniques. But as I worked through the factors, to be honest, I was not quoting the fragrance in a cup. And if anything, I am brutally honest with my tasting of this. And so I began to suspect that during the brewing, the temperature of the water was changing. It was Sergio Michael back in Trieste that told me many things, but one thing he said, David, each brewing water temperature, of course, gives you a different coffee. So I got my metrology hat on again, and using this rig, I began to document the performance of all the machines, and this is where the bead probe, the sense, is right up on top of the coffee. There's no hiding. So I began to document the performance of all the machines on the West Coast. The best of them, La Marzocco Linea, would climb 6 degrees during the 25 seconds it took to make the shot. The worst of them would plunge up to 20 degrees. My theory at the time was you had to hold the brewing temperature to 203 degrees with less than a half a degree of change, and only then the fragrance would make it into the cup. I was furious. A $39 coffee, Mr. Coffee has better control than these $10,000 machines that are all over the place. And I wrote this, and I wrote this, and I wrote this some more in a series of articles entitled Engineered Mediocrity. So what happened was I was able to narrow the range of temperature to 2 degrees, working with La Marzocco engineer John Blackwell in '95 on the machine I was using, the La Marzocco. Immediately, the coffee was darker and richer, but still a mishmash of flavors. On February 28th, 2001, working with Roger Whitman of La Marzocco, John Beekt, an independent genius that runs VersaLab, and myself, we took an Omega PID controller. Think of it like a computerized thermostat, and we stabilized the brewing water temperature to 203 to a half a degree of error for the first time in human history. And that prototype, the actual prototype is here, and the little controller's hanging in that pastry box on the side on your left. So it was true. We had created this culinary art. And now, in 2014, every machine manufacturer has a PID-controlled machine, and they fall all over themselves to claim the best temperature stability. So, the espresso as a culinary art actually started that day, February 28th, in 2001. And what the new machines have revealed is the extraordinary sensitivity of this coffee to flow rate. Here's the coffee flowing out of a machine before we modified temperature all the way perfect. The white streaks literally are dead flavor areas. It's a pretty decent pour. Here's what it looks like in 2013 on the absolute tricked out equipment from Nuovo Simonelli. And color is flavor, and the viscosity is evident. So, what the new machines have revealed is the impossible sensitivity of the coffee itself to exactly how fast it flows into the cup. I don't want to bore you to death here, but we have a 2-second window. When we work that bar, between 24 and 26, if the shot is too fast, it's destroyed. It's sour astringent. If the shot is too slow, 28 seconds, the flavors incinerate and it's hollow. In this window of 2 seconds, there's 30 unique different coffees as different varietal flavors. The Ethiopians compete for your attention, or the Indian Malabar, impossibly beautiful. And of course, any culinary art requires a presentation. So in 1989, we began developing latte art patterns. These flowing patterns are merely silky foams doing what they want to do. This one is called Shadow Heart. This one, Wreath and Heart, and finally, Caffe Latte Rosetta. So there's more work to do. I would really like to get a better grinder. I would really like to tune the mineral content of the water. But I'd have to say yes. My teasing muse coffee has kept her fragrant promise she made to me 54 years ago in the food giant. Thank you.